Duran. If you don't know anything about him, just look at the cover, and now you know a lot about him. The one thing, and I'm going to make it very brief because there's a really good selection of slides and images that he has brought to us. He lives in Austin, Texas. He's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Grew up in Lockhart, Maxwell, and so many of his images have that rural feeling to them. The one thing I can say, if you travel and you're ever in Austin, Texas, go to the Bergstrom Airport, go to American Airlines, and an extension of his mural is longer than this wall. It is stunning, right above American Airlines. And if you see that, then you know a lot about what he does, and he does some remarkable works. A lot of community work as well, lots of murals in the community. He has work in different museums, including here at the Witte. So I'm going to give him lots of time so we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending and spending the afternoon with me as I talk about my paintings. I grew up in Lockhart, Texas. I went to high school in Lockhart, Texas. My family were tenant farmers. My parents were tenant farmers near Martindale, Texas, from about the 1920s up until the mid-1960s. So a lot of my subject matter does come from that experience. I'm the third youngest of 10 children. And so some of those images relate to that history. Painting is something that I've done since I was 11 or 12 in public schools. I do have some brothers that used to like to draw and paint quite a bit and was therefore exposed to painting at home and then through the public schools. My career as an artist was inspired, or was rather promoted, by being a student during the Texas Commission on the Arts and Education programming in Lockhart, Texas in the late 1970s. And so that was a turning point for me as far as my decision to pursue art, to study art and then hopefully continue to become an artist. So that's my background history. This behind me is the first mural that I ever painted. I have always had a lot of community support from Lockhart, Texas. After my second year at UT of Austin, it's a small community of about 9,000 people, and so a lot of people knew that I was interested in art. They knew my brothers, they knew my family. And because of my experience with the Arts and Education program, they were aware that I was studying art. And so therefore, the city manager decided to commission me to paint a mural for the city park, the municipal park. Mr. Cecil Massey, who had been the city manager of a small town in South Texas, maybe Kennedy or Nixon, where they had actually converted a water tank into a theater in the round. And he had studied theater, I believe, at Waco with the Mr. Baker, the very well-known theater artist. I can't think of his, Paul Baker. And so he was very supportive of the arts. And so I was commissioned to do a painting for the municipal park. And since it was a public project, I decided to focus on the history of Lockhart, and went through their archives of the Lockhart Post-Register, went through several books. Unfortunately, I don't have a color version of it, but that's me maybe 3 or 4 years after the mural. Let's see. My work evolved when I was in college, when I was in school, and took the viewpoint of making narrative works. And the reason for that is that my father was an immigrant. He immigrated to Texas from Mexico, central Mexico, when he was 4 years old. At the end, or the latter part of the Mexican Revolution. They were from Guanajuato, which is a central state, and were pretty much tired of all the different factions going through Guanajuato and all the problems that they had just because of their location. And so they decided to move to Texas. Luckily, they had, my father had two aunts that had families and lived in Maxwell, Texas, and in Martindale, Texas. So they moved to Central Texas, and they worked as tenant farmers in Martindale, and then later on moved closer to Lockhart, just west, or rather just east of Maxwell. And so when I was a junior in college, the summer before, I lived with my brother and decided to make drawings. Drawings that were autobiographical, drawings that reflected my upbringing, that reflected the buildings and the landscapes that I had seen growing up in Maxwell, Texas. This is called The Runners. And that series, I'll back up because I want to talk about how my process all throughout my experience of paintings was using whatever tools that I had at my use that were available. And the way that I settled on this cropping of images was that I used a large opaque projector to stick my little drawings and to be able to project them, but were very difficult to hold in place. And so as it was moving around in a darkened room, I thought that it would be interesting to crop those images as they would typically not be seen. And to tilt the drawings to show maybe more of an emphasis or of movement, and to make it appear somewhat a little bit unusual to attract the viewer's attention. And so that group of paintings, I think there was 3 or 4 paintings that I submitted to the Dallas Museum of Art, to their Awards to Artists program, and I was given I was awarded for the ages between 18 and 25. So I won a grant basically from the Dallas Museum of Art with 4 paintings that I had done earlier that year, which was very unexpected. And then soon thereafter, I got a request to have an exhibit in Houston at a gallery. And so I went ahead and did the show. I graduated from UT and didn't really think about preparing for graduate school. I guess I'd been too busy making paintings, and so I really hadn't made those preparations until the end. One of my professors, he didn't ask me, but I wasn't going to go to graduate school. So 2 years later, I started working with the Texas Commission on the Arts and Education program. And my first residency was in Brownsville, Texas. I was working for La Esperanza Villa Bethany Home for Girls. La Esperanza was basically a home for juvenile delinquents. I guess you could call them juvenile delinquents. They were from the TYC, or their parents had placed them there for their own safekeeping and for their own good. But I was there for 9 months, and I produced a large mural that Dr. Romo documented, and it's still there. It faded because of the budget was a pretty small budget, and I didn't know that much about mural painting on cinder block walls. And so it faded, but they repainted it several times, and it's still there. But I made 2 paintings when I was there, and this is one of them. It's called The Haircut, and it's my memories of my grandparents that lived close to us when I was a child, up until I was 4 or 5 years old. And I still remember the home that they lived in. It was a small house, and they had a wood-burning stove, and they had immigrated in 1929 and had gone back a few times, but had settled in Texas by 1927. And one of the stories I remember is that my grandmother, she hand-rolled her own Bugler cigarettes. And my father later told me that my older brothers would go to her when they were about 8 or 9 years old so they could smoke cigarettes. And so that was kind of and entertaining. But in that time, it was very important because I had the time to develop my techniques and more of an understanding of acrylic paint. And that's always been real important to me, is to have the time that I really like to spend on the paintings. And then I went back to Austin after that residency, and that was in the middle 80s, mid 80s, late 80s. You'll remember probably that there was a big drop in the price of oil, and so the state government and the grants kind of dried up for the time being. So I actually worked at a Mexican restaurant. I worked for Chuy's in Austin. I worked for them for 2 years and learned everything that they did. The women showed me how to do everything, so that's what I did. But at the same time, I always found time to work on my paintings, and I realized that I'm not going to be producing a large number of them. I was already represented by a gallery and sold some things, but my objective has always been to make the highest quality of work that I could. And so even though it took me, it may have taken me 3 or 4 months of working on the weekends, I made 2 paintings in that time period of about a year and a half or so. And this is one of them. This is called The Smell of Cotton. It's 4 by 4 feet, and it's now owned, it was collected by Apple Computer in Austin. And in fact, they still have it, because not long ago, maybe half a year ago, there was a company that was, they're professional furniture movers, and they were moving furniture from a building owned by Apple, and one of the workers contacted me via my website and said, we found this painting in this room, and we noticed that on the back it has your name, so he researched me and said, we want to know, is this one of your works? And he said, would you like to have it back? And I said, well, yeah, I'd like to have it back if you're offering to give me back a painting. But I contacted him, and later he went through his boss and found out that indeed it was owned by Apple Computer. They contacted them and said, it's our property. Would you please return it to us? But it was one of those projects that those paintings is what, in my opinion, propelled me to be considered for the airport project, because of the high quality, the time that I took for it to do it, and it was with acrylic paints. Now this is referring back to the mural that I did in Brownsville from '85 to '86. And it was a public mural, and I was working with the residents as well as with the stakeholders, the people that administered the home, and then also the people that had started the actual the home. And I basically absorbed the culture of South Texas. I'm from Central Texas. I absorbed as much as I could from the residents, and they brought me images of things that were important to them, like, of course, the Virgen de Guadalupe, things like lowrider cars, and in fact, there was one resident who had been living or moved there from Brooklyn, New York, in the early '80s, and so he brought the whole idea of hip hop. In fact, he did a drawing about hip hop, which I hadn't really heard about. And so we included hip hop, and we included Esteban Horzan, and basically the whole stories of the Mexican American community in Brownsville as they told it to me, because a lot of their families, their parents or their fathers had been in Vietnam, or they had gone through these different experiences, and not only local issues but also international issues, like the idea of nuclear energy. Is nuclear energy really good? In a kind of broad way. And so I put it all together. And this is just one of them. But this is the face of it, the face of the mural. Of course, included the arts, the performing arts with the guitar, and the idea of gang warfare or gangland type conflicts because they themselves had been very much immersed in gangs. Their parents, their fathers, it was all part of the culture of Brownsville, and to this day in different parts of the country. And these are portraits of the founding members, the priest, and Sister Mary, I believe was her name, Filemon Vela, who was a very big supporter, and Miss Mary Iturria, who was also a big supporter of the home, which was started by Dr. Juan Sanchez. And this is the other painting that I made. When I returned and decided to focus just on a couple of big paintings, this is called The Proposal. And it's more of a family story. My father repeated stories all the time, like I'm sure a lot of families do. And it was either stories about how they came from Mexico and why they came to Mexico, some of the things that had happened. And the other things were more closely related to our immediate family. Like he would always tell us the story of how he asked for my mother's hand in marriage from my grandfather. And how he was rejected. The grandfather said, no way, that's not going to happen. And for different reasons. And so, but then he said, well, ask her what she thinks. And of course, we all know that they did get married and they had 10 children and we all lived happily ever after. But it was one of those things that I wanted to somehow portray in an illustration. And this was my rendition. Let's see. The other paintings after that became somewhat more autobiographical, but a little bit more contemporary. I was part of several workshops in printmaking. I did woodcut prints with a Mexican artist named Adolfo Mexiac, who did a workshop in Austin. He's the artist that did the image of the chained hands after the 1968 Olympics and the riots that occurred. That's Adolfo Mexiac. But with the woodcuts, the prints themselves, the white line around the figures because of the negative was very intriguing to me. And so I incorporated that into a couple of paintings. And of course, since it's a night scene, I thought that it would be very appropriate to have a slight glow around the figures, and this is based on the botanical or the rose garden at Zilker Park in Austin. And it's a small painting, maybe 2 by 3 feet. You can see also the influence of one of the main people that I studied with was the artist Peter Saul, the painter Peter Saul, and so in fact he and I were the only ones up in the studios on the weekends. He hadn't built a studio yet, and I didn't have a studio, so I would go up into the advanced painting studio, even though I was not in advanced painting, and would use the studio, and I saw him using day-glow colors and paints. And so then I started using them. I taught a few classes at Texas State University and at ACC, but it wasn't until 1993 that I was selected to paint a mural for the Zaragoza Recreation Center, part of the Art in Public Places program of the city of Austin. And did several drawings just independently for my own research until I met with the advisory council. And then they kind of put me on they advised me that it was a very difficult venture for them, a process just to get the recreation center built. And so they were very intent on the murals to be about their history, which I was not really that familiar with. I didn't grow up in Austin. I moved there as a student. But they basically told me the story of the neighborhood and why they had built the parque, how it had been established, and who had established it. And in fact, all 3 of the principal founders were born in Mexico. They were born in Mexico, they were born in Guanajuato primarily, and they had immigrated to Central Texas. The main founder had been a shoemaker by trade, Mr. Candelas. Mr. Guerra was a carpenter by trade, and then Mr. Guerrero he and his wife owned a small grocery store. But they had founded the recreation center and the parque specifically to observe the Mexican holidays of the 16 and Cinco de Mayo. And so the first 2 panels, the vertical panels in the clear store, in the bridge room were the Cinco de Mayo, or the 16, and then the other one was the Cinco de Mayo. and that's the Cinco de Mayo panel. But it was because of the niece of Mr. Guerra, who had kept some of the posters or the announcements for these festivals. She showed me her archives, and one of the posters specifically, how it was arranged with some of the Mexican heroes, and then of course, the schedule of events in the middle and what would happen. But just that simple arrangement was what I used for the subject matter that I would then portray in the murals. This is, it's 25 feet tall by 15 feet across. And I had approximately a month and a half to paint all three of them because I went in there when the building was being made. In fact, there was no heat. It was February, and they had actually used the wrong kind of primer on the walls, so they had to reprime the walls. But I had to be out of there by April because that's when the architects were going to go and finalize, for example, the color of the floors and the window frames and things like that. So it was not. I didn't have the luxury that I would have with my paintings, and so I had to do it much more quickly. This is the first wall that I painted, the Comité Patriota, and there's portraits of the founders, and then of Ignacio Zaragoza at the very top, and the train from the Mexican Revolution, the Ballet Folklorico, and the platform that had actually been built by, or rather poured and built by people from the neighborhood, the Zaragoza neighborhood. And this is the 16 panel. And it shows the contributions of the founders in reference back to Mr. Candelas, who was a shoemaker by trade. And he also brought the first Spanish-speaking movies to Austin and brought several Mexican performers as well. On the right-hand side is actually a very poignant 14-stanza poem written by Mr. Guerra about the drowning death of Mr. Guerrero at the Colorado River on a Sunday afternoon, and how he got caught in the undertow and consequently drowned. But it was very successful. It was on the cover of Texas Architect, summer of 1996, and was recently added to the National Archive of Registry of Historic Parks. And then before I even painted the 96 mural, I was selected to be commissioned for a mural at the airport in 1995 when I was conducting another residency or a mural project with an elementary school in Houston, Crockett Elementary. I worked with a whole 5th grade class for about, I think the whole entire year practically. Working with them as an artist, a teaching artist, and they did drawings of their own subjects, their families, and what they liked. And then I basically organized it, and we painted it on a wall. But this was, in that meantime, when I was living in Houston and in Austin, back and forth, and I was selected to be a finalist, and so I had maybe, I guess, 2 months. And so put together drawings, and I said, well, if I'm going to do something, I may as well just make it more related to my work, which is more autobiographical. It's more about a rural background. And I thought, well, what would be appropriate for an airport? And in my estimation, the people at airports were typically going to visit family, or they're coming from someplace else, or they're going to go visit a loved one or someplace that they like. And so I thought about the reunions or the gatherings at my grandparents' house after church on Sundays. And I had done things kind of related to that, and so I decided to make the whole. I made 2 suites of drawings, the east and west, because they considered the terminal to be the entire site. And I thought, well, I'll do this two ways. I'll make it about that scene and what would happen, but I'll make one suite earlier in the day and the second one later in the day. Like a movie would be made, and all I'll do is I'll just pan the camera from this part of the property all the way across to this part of the property, and I'll make it an entire day. And that's what I did. I made the drawings with charcoal on paper, and I was selected. And then, but I didn't make the paintings until 4 years later, 1999, because they had to build the airport. So kind of had to wait for everything. But they fit in perfectly, and a friend of mine and I we rented a truck and we lifted them up and we shoved them in there, and there they are. They're not going to be moving anytime real soon. Let's see. And this is another view of that. But it was very exciting. I rented a warehouse as my studio, and I built the stretcher bars out of aluminum angle iron with wood to staple the canvas and everything, and gessoed it, and used an opaque, or rather a slide projector at that time, to project my drawings, rough sketch it, and then go back into it and finish it out. Shortly thereafter, I was contacted by the superintendent of the South Texas ISD, which is based in Brownsville, and they plan to build a new campus in Mercedes, and it's called Science Med, or Med High rather, and they wanted me to paint a mural for the library. It's called Biblioteca Las Americas, and he wanted it to be about the history of the Rio Grande from Laredo down to Boca Chica, both sides of the river. And so I spent several months researching. I went to the Hidalgo County, the museum they have in Hidalgo County in Edinburgh. I read several books. Luckily, I can't think of the author, it's called The Purple Land, where he compiled a number of photographs. I knew the work of Robert Runyon, more or less. I'd seen his work before, his photographs. And also the work of the illustrator Jose Cisneros from El Paso. And so combining all those images, I came up with these different panels. This one, those two, and then the final one. And I believe, this is the combination of all those panels. They're canvas, they're acrylic on canvas, stretch canvas. And I hired a furniture maker to make the stretcher bar for the central one, because it's a slightly convex wall. And so I wanted it to follow the contour. And being a furniture maker, he spliced the wood on the top and bottom so that it would bend. And that's how it was installed. I'm sure you can tell that the work has been evolving ever since I've been doing the work. That mural was very significant in my evolution, because I had always been interested in depicting motion and movement, but I wanted to find better references, and without hiring models to do all kinds of poses. And I had known or had heard or read a little bit about the photographer Edward Muybridge. Edward Muybridge was the photographer that proved that at a certain point in a horse's gallop, that all four hooves leave the ground. Apparently there was a big wager between two, I think maybe Stanton and some other millionaire from California that owned horses. And one said yes, the other guy said no. And so he was hired by the one that won, because he basically lined up a bunch of cameras with string, and as the horse galloped, it broke the string and opened.
Attention, Witte Museum visitors. The museum will be closing in 15 minutes. Upgrade your ticket to a Witte Museum membership and visit all year.
Thank you.
Attention, Witte Museum visitors. The museum will be closing in 15 minutes. Upgrade your ticket to a Witte Museum membership and visit all year.
Oh, excuse me. So anyway, Edward Muybridge and his whole collection. I went and bought all the books I could find of his work, and I started using them as references. I still use them today whenever I need a figure in motion and just to see the mechanics of how the body moves. But then I started using it for my own work, my own autobiographical images. I started incorporating that. This is El Caballero, the horseman or the gentleman. But going back to my rural backgrounds and the settings, and family stories, mostly based on my brothers and my cousins and the things that we did after we left being tenant farmers. And this is from this is from '01. So gradually I've become, I guess, I've used more and more specific references, whereas in the beginning, my drawings and paintings were drawn from memory. I didn't have really that many photographs to base them on, and so with my training in life drawing and observation, I would put together what I could. But later on, I wanted to have more specific details like the folds of clothing, the casting of shadows, reflections, and things like that. So I actually went back and started painting from life. Objects. My wife worked for a landscape company that installed floral arrangements in buildings. And so we got a lot of samples from them that she would rescue, and so this was actually done from different plants that we owned. And there's a window in the house where we now live that is very similar, but I imagined that it could be a greenhouse that was built out from the window or as part of the window. And then so I arranged these different objects or the drawings of the plants and then included them in the paintings. And then the mural work, my murals have always continued pretty much the same as my paintings. It seems like every 2 or 3 years somebody contacts me with an interest of painting a mural. This was painted for the Montopolis Neighborhood Center in Austin, Texas, and it was presented as a gift from Tokyo Electron, which is located not too far away. And it was a great opportunity to learn about another neighborhood in Austin, Texas. Montopolis was actually located, it was founded, or it was considered to be the site of Waterloo, what was known as Waterloo, which was actually later moved, or rather, actually, they considered it to be the capital of Texas after Houston, but they moved it farther west because of the location. It was a higher elevation from the river than Montopolis. But a lot of but it's an interesting region. The Chisholm Trail Roundup went through there. Apparently, there's evidence that the Camino Real also went through an area known as Pilot Knob, which is an extinct volcano towards Bastrop. I've read Noah Smithwick talking about riding from San Antonio through Lockhart and towards Bastrop in that general vicinity of Texas. And so it was also the site of several freedmen colonies that were established during Reconstruction, and then also the Mexican sharecroppers that lived closer to where is now the airport, and Creedmoor and Dale and Linton Springs towards Lockhart. When sharecropping was no longer a viable system, they started moving into the city of Austin, and so this was one of the areas where they settled. And it has quite an extensive history up to the present day. It was always a neglected part of Austin. There was a very significant priest, Father Everwood. Father Everwood. Everwood, I think is his name, who was very significant in the social programs that he established in Montopolis. The Holly Street Power Plant was another part of East Austin that had presented problems for the neighborhood for the longest time. They considered the noise to be a nuisance, and they were always concerned with the possibility of the danger that would result from an explosion. And so over the years, different community groups they were trying to get it decommissioned. And as in an effort to do that, or rather to bring attention to that, an architect that was hired to design a wall around the plant commissioned different artists to make paintings on the actual wall. And this was my first depiction of a La Quinceañera, which was as a girl's 15th birthday party. And I'm not really even sure how I became aware of quinceañeras. I had one sister, and she had a quinceañera when she was 15. I was probably 4 or 5 years old. But somehow, I think through different people that I had met, probably other artists I had met, with a more, I guess, more of an anchor in a Hispanic or community, had grown up in a barrio with more Mexicans around them, probably had told me about quinceañeras. And so I thought it would be a good idea as a concept of how to present the people that live in the area and what they would typically do, which was kind of what I was doing with my autobiographical paintings anyway. It just became an extension of that experience, but in a different way and about different communities and from different points of view. And I continued to do that. Also, this was at one time at the Greyhound bus station in Austin. The Greyhound company started a program called Reflections, the Reflections program, and I think they did one here in San Antonio, maybe with artist Alex Rubio, or maybe even with Vincent Valdez. I think they did some as well. But it was a depiction of different observances in the Mexican-American community, Las Posadas, of course, the Conjunto Norteño, there's a very well-known accordionist, Johnny DeGollado from Montopolis, and the kiosk at Parque Zaragoza, and then, of course, the Mexic-Arte, or the Dia de los Muertos observances. And it's I think it's maybe 6 by 16 feet on wood panel with acrylics. And that's the mural at the actual bus station. And then this is from 2008. It's an oil painting. It's a small oil painting, about 18 by 18 inches. And after those murals, I kind of wanted to take a break from the murals, and I wanted to focus or refocus back on my autobiographical content, and had been using oil paint a little bit more because I used oil paint as a teenager, and I really hadn't used it that much since. So I wanted to go back into oil painting. This is called The Crossing. And again, it refers back to the stories that my father would tell about when they immigrated, and when he was 4 years old, and what they experienced and how they got there. And these are stories that he would tell over and over again. And I didn't want to make it an illustration, but I wanted to be more evocative, I guess, of what may have happened in a very basic and human context of a family or a couple arriving and being thankful and saying grace or giving their thanks. And at the same time, I was still using more photographs, more photography to photograph models, a lot of them who were me and my wife. We would pose, and I would take photographs and for the specifics of folds and of the clothing and the expressions and shadows and things like that. But this was actually exhibited here before. It was part of the Texas Rivers book project that was here, I think, maybe 3 years ago. The book signing was here, and it was exhibited in the gallery, and it's now in a private collection. This is the Justin Dart Center for Students with Disabilities at the University of Houston. It was commissioned by the University of Houston, their permanent art collection, about him and his contributions, his advocacy. He was a big advocate for the ADA. In fact, he was one of the main advocates, and his life story was the reason why. He had contracted or developed polio, as a child and was sent to a sanatorium by his parents, and always remembered the warmth and care that he had received. Apparently, his parents were not, I presume that they were somewhat aloof to him, and for whatever reason. But he continued his advocacy throughout his life and his career. He fostered. They opened a Tupperware company in Japan in the early '60s and hired women, which was, I guess, unheard of at that time. And they even started a wheelchair basketball league in Japan, and then moved he had attended U of H and was always supportive of integration and politically active throughout his life. Yes. 5 more minutes? Okay. Well, these are some of the panels that are part of that mural. And then in '06, I had the distinct pleasure of making a painting for the Dublin Dr. Pepper in Dublin, Texas, which was family-owned most of the time, started by Mr. Cecil Lyons and then run by his daughter Grace during World War II. The interesting story about her is that she was able to convince the government that they should be allowed to buy sugar for Dr. Pepper during World War II, because what I've heard or read was that she said, well, if we're sending everybody, all of our men and women and young men to fight, shouldn't they be able to have a real sugar Dr. Pepper? And so, of course, they said, yes, absolutely. And so she was able to buy sugar when most businesses were not allowed to buy sugar because it was used for bombs. And my work continues with different aspects of Mexican culture, American culture. I was invited to be part of a show that had to do with lucha libre, the Mexican wrestling, which was one of the things that we watched from San Antonio when we were kids. We watched, on Saturday afternoon, we watched All-Star Wrestling, and then after that, they would air lucha libre after that. So we always watched All-Star Wrestling on Saturday afternoon. But interestingly enough, I didn't know that much about lucha libre, but in contemporary times, and probably even then, it's very much of a social commentary. It's very much of theater used as social commentary. There's good guys and there's bad guys, and they dress accordingly. And of course, mostly the good guys win, but there's always some kind of a lesson, I guess, that they try to present. Now, also technically, in terms of my mural work, has always influenced my paintings, because, for example, in this one, there's a higher eye level, and this is actually a commission for a friend of the family who has her homestead in Iowa, and so I based it on photographs that she had of the homestead and what she told me about it. But the idea of using a higher point of view, I could include many more things, as I did with the mural for the La Biblioteca Las Americas, which is entitled The Last Haven. And then some of my other images have more of my earlier influences, which is surrealism, the Salvador Dali, and even Mexican art, and Mexican folk art.
Thank you for visiting the Witte Museum.
Consists of so much what we consider to be surrealism and fantasy and things like that. And I did these for my own entertainment, basically.
It's now closed.
And this is the role and history of education in East Austin. It tells the story of the role of public education for Mexican Americans in Austin. And these are some of the panels. Let's see. And then I always go back to my autobiographical work. I always go back to when I was a child, living in the middle of cotton fields, basically, as tenant farmers, and some of the things that we did on. This is entitled Summer Nights. I remember my cousins would come and visit on summer nights, and they would probably bring a small record player, a portable record player, and they would spin 45s on the front porch and blow bubbles, and that was our entertainment. So those memories are always, they come back. I think those are more of the bird pieces, which actually started because of a birdhouse that my father had made. Upon his retirement, my father worked since he was probably able to walk, in Mexico, herding goats, and then as a tenant farmer, and then when he stopped doing that, he went and worked as a janitor for the school district, and then he retired twice. But anyway, one of the few things that I saw him make was a little birdhouse that he made out of some piece of discarded wood, and he kind of sawed into it and painted it, and put it on a post or a tree or whatever it was, a branch, and I just thought that was a really kind of a poignant example of folk art that he had made, and so I thought it was just a very a moving gesture on his part. So I I started with birdhouses, and I entitled it Casitas del Pueblo, Little Houses of the People, and so I've done several of those images. But I'll stop talking and just show you what. This is the only printed mural that I've done. It's actually a laser print on dye bond material and then mounted. With, of course, the painting is original, and I had it scanned, a really high scan, a very detailed scan. These are the beekeepers. Based on my grandparents' little farm, they actually had bees. I remember one of my uncles coming in with a big beehive or honeycombs, and they had milk cows, and they made their own queso fresco and things like that. And since we're in San Antonio, one of my distinct memories were of these vendors that would pick up. I heard people talking about fresh fruit from the valley. They would come to they were from San Antonio, I think, and so they would always come around in trucks, and they would go to small communities that had Mexican-American communities, and they would have bags of grapefruit and oranges and different terracotta ware that my aunts would buy. But one of the things I remember distinctly was that they would have whistles, little clay whistles. And so I remember that as a very poignant memory of clay whistles, and so I decided to make a painting based on that, and came to realize how extensive the history of whistles is in the Americas, and found examples made from stone, from bone, and all very fanciful configurations of whistles in the history of Mexico and Latin America and the Americas, and throughout the world as well. And this is the most recent one, mural installation, children's drawings that were sculpted and made part of the frame. This is at Montopolis, and it tells the story of Montopolis, the founders, and its history going back only to about the 1960s when the recreation center was established. And then the frame is made of pecan wood because of their proximity to the Colorado River, which at that point has one of the greatest varieties of pecan trees. And then that was 3 years ago. Established, it was installed 3 years ago. Here's another view, and that's it.
Well, you have been very productive. Certainly, and some of those pieces are monumental. I mean, they take up a lot of space. They could take a whole wall. That's one observation. on a closer observation, many of your figures are tall people.
Excuse me.
And I know that we talked about this once, and I think your cousins or your brothers all were a little bit higher.
Taller.
Higher.
Yeah, I think I'm the shortest one in my family, other than my sister. But yeah, we're all fairly tall. My grandfather, my mother's father, was not tall, but for his generation, I think he's probably 6'2" or so. And so consequently, my brothers are, and my nieces actually are kind of tall too.
And you'll see that in the, we haven't seen the gallery, but in the gallery, observe that the figures are taller than you normally see.
That is largely my observation of the Mexican muralist, specifically Siqueiros, who kind of exaggerates the stature by looking up, and then also comic books, like Marvel comics. One of the things I remember my brothers always reading were Marvel comics, and looking at the illustrations in that. Also the work of Thomas Hart Benton, which I really didn't know about until after I started doing the figures. There was a little bit taller, a little bit longer. And then also, I think a lot of it was that when I was first drawing these ideas, I would draw them on a desk, on a table. And so I didn't really think about, well, maybe I should prop up an easel or something, or get a table easel. And so a lot of times I would draw them, and they would be somewhat a little bit longer. I had taken live drawing, and so I knew that there was 1 to 7.5 heads. But to me, spatially, it just seemed to make more sense, or it seemed more interesting to be able to occupy the entire frame with the figure, make it more monumental, like Michelangelo or El Greco. And so it kind of all came together, and when I started doing that, people noticed it, and then also trying to manipulate it even more with the way that I was projecting the drawings onto the canvases and tilting it in different directions, and noticing the distortions. And so I started working within that as a way of making the work noticeable, really.
You're pretty much consistent with that. I noticed that particular painting of where you have Montopoulos and the elan and the branches.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tree branches are really long limbs. And some of the figures in there are taller. We're talking 6'5" type individuals, almost basketball player, Final Four, tall individuals. But then when you get to Johnny de Hoyayo, that's a very standard kind of look. When you have that particular, and everybody in it is kind of standard. So, but you mentioned a couple of artists. Who inspired you? Who do you name a couple of individuals? You said Siqueiros and Thomas Hart.
Yeah, I did a research paper on the Mexican muralists when I was a freshman in college, but I've always been exposed to art, to American art. My art teacher had examples of all kinds of art, modern, traditional art in our classroom. One of my brothers that liked to draw and paint a lot, he was a big fan of Winslow Homer. He made copies of drawings and paintings after Winslow Homer. He would do watercolors from photographs. But I always remember him and John Singer Sargent, which to this day, I always see things about John Singer Sargent on PBS, his whole evolution as a painter. So I was always exposed to American art in school, of course, and the images of Dali, his distortion of figures, and the surrealist, Max Ernst, and then some of the what's it called, Orpheism or Odalism, the fantasy artists. And then just recently, who was it? Yesterday, I was showing my mural at the one of the role and history of education in East Austin, how it's different panels. And he said, that reminds me so much of Hieronymus Bosch. And he was right, because of the way it's divided and all the action that's going on, all the different scenarios and the different stages. And he said, that reminds me so much of Hieronymus Bosch. And I said, yeah, you're right, because that was one of the artists whose work I always thought was very, very interesting. And I remember seeing that in my high school art room, because there was an example of his panels. And also the Van Eyck brothers, their triptych. That to me was also always very, very interesting, the way that it was arranged. The more I think about it, all those elements have always been around me. I just haven't always, I guess, recognized them as such.
Well, okay. My two questions. Anyone have a question from the audience here? Thoughts? We answer most. You did a great job in explaining what he did and why he does it. So let's give a hand. And I know we have to go on to the gallery. Mary Margaret, what are we doing next? Here.
Well, thank you all for being here. I hope you'll join us tomorrow. We have 2 panels. Cecilia will be facilitating one of them. They're really interesting. They start at 9:30 and will be done by 11:45. So join us now in what we call the Ewing Halsell Hall, which is straight across the Dinosaur Gallery, back into the South Texas Heritage Center. And we will open the show Kinship and Culture, featuring his Fidencio's paintings and many other cherished objects from the Witte collection that don't get seen very often. So thank you all, and we'll see you over there.